Well, now on Radio 4, the next in our series of talks with a personal viewpoint, Forethought, introduced by Nairi Woods.
So here we are at the RSA in central London for Forethought, a series of talks offering personal viewpoints. Tonight's talk is by Dr. Ahdaf Soueif, one of the Arab world's leading intellectuals. Shortlisted for the Booker Prize for her novel, The Map of Love, her writings take us into the intimate lives of people in her country of birth, Egypt. And for those of us who are not Egyptian, her novels are a window into an extraordinary, rich and other society. In 2007, Ahdaf expanded that window on other worlds, creating the Palestine Festival of Literature. For 3 years, her work has been taking Western artists and writers to Palestinian cities and towns, an exercise she describes as the most important thing she's done in her life. In recent weeks, Ahdaf Soueif's voice has become known to all of us who listen to Radio 4. Sitting in Tahrir Square, she gave voice, as she's been doing for many years now, to a yearning for more democratic government felt by so many young Arab people. Ahdaf, welcome.
Hello and good evening. The point of me tonight, I guess, is that I'm just fresh back from Cairo, where we've been having a revolution. It was very odd arriving at the airport and finding everything unchanged. Where I come from, everything feels so radically changed, even the light seems different. I also feel very different because it feels very different being Egyptian now than it did 3 weeks ago. It is to that extent that this revolution has been personal, and it is to that extent that the last 40 years of our lives as Egyptians have been progressively darker and more burdensome. I just feel remarkably lighter. I was pulled aside for the first time ever by the customs people. And I think it's because I smiled too broadly. As I was passing through the nothing to declare, the guy was coming towards me. And then at one point he said something, and I said, well, because we're having a revolution. And he said, we're what? I said, in Egypt. He said, okay, I'll accept that, he said. What has been happening is that for the last 40 years, we have seen our country slip away from anything that we can recognize as Egypt. Well, that was really starting from the days of President Sadat and the kind of societal engineering that he was doing. I mean, if you think, for example, of what President Sadat did in terms of shutting down every avenue of political dissent except the religious one. So basically, this is going back a while, but what he was trying to do was he was trying to turn the country around from the ideals of the revolution of 1952, so turn it around from pan-Arabism into an insular sort of Egypt first, turn it around from a kind of sort of benign makeshift socialism into a capitalist economy, and so on. And to do that, he had to decimate the left, and basically decimate every avenue of opposition, and nurture the Islamists to beat the left with them. And that is what I'm referring to as societal engineering. Now, this eventually, of course, leads into extremism, into narrow ideologies, into a dourness that's pervaded Egyptian society, all of which are things which culturally we regard as foreign to ourselves. Because traditionally, an Egyptian would say that Egypt is happy in its diversity, that Egyptians come in all shapes and colors, that we've always been a successfully multicultural society in that people are not required to renounce their cultures or to melt into some melting pot. Tolerance, for example, and certainly a sort of joie de vivre. So all these, bit by bit, get eroded. And then, of course, then you've got the regime that we have just got rid of, which has ruled the country for 30 years. In the last 10 years, I think that we felt that it wasn't just our economy, our politics, our position in the region vis-à-vis our friends, our neighbors, it wasn't just all that was being eroded. There was messing with our actual characters. There was messing with the texture of society, because if you keep people so utterly ground down, if you run down the education system, you run down the health system, you basically run the country not in the interests of the people, then eventually society itself cracks. And the jokes that we told against ourselves became increasingly more and more bitter. And so Mr. Mubarak says to his son, okay, you want to take over, you want to rule the country, fine, I'm giving you this box, and it's got 10 mice in it. Take it away and open it in the middle of, let's say, Tahrir Square, and come back to me at the end of the day with the box and the mice all in it. So, of course, Mr. Gamal Mubarak goes to the square, he opens the box and all the mice run out, and he goes back and his father says, well, you know, I told you can't run the country. And he shows him how you run the country, and you run the country, but you have these mice in the box, and all the way to the square, you're shaking it. And eventually, when you get to the square, you put it down, and the mice are so dazed and bedraggled that they can't run out. And then you close the box and you take it home again. And that's how you keep the country under your heel. So I think that basically we wandered so far from our notion of what we were. Now, Egypt is a very old country, I don't need to say, and it has a sense of itself. And it's not a sense of itself as being exceptional or better than anyone else. It just has a sense of itself as being very old, as being the vanguard of civilization, as being where great ideas were developed at the beginning of history, and as, I don't know, it's a bit metaphysical to say this, but almost as a keeper or a guardian of the soul of the world. And to kind of see what was happening, not just to things that we could eventually fix, but to our characters and the way we functioned in our societies was very difficult. And now, of course, since 2005, and before that, but from 2005 specifically, we have had movements. There hasn't been a day when there hasn't been unrest on the streets. But it has seemed that the regime, in its power, in its relationships, in what it had already done to the country, was all-powerful. Nobody could work out how you could actually dislodge it. Well, clearly we have dislodged at least part of it now. And I have been trying to think, what was the tipping point? Of course, Tunis. The fact that Tunis happened and that they were successful was an inspiration. And of course, things have been simmering for a very long time. But I think that we can point at several things which have created such anger that I believe that they have been, one by one, pushing us closer to this moment. I think that what happened with Gaza, what happened with the bombardment of Gaza, and with Egypt playing the role that it did, first in training Fatah elements to basically carry out a coup against Hamas in Gaza, which Hamas preempted by carrying out its own coup, but then it was known that Egypt had trained Fatah elements to essentially carry out a civil war in Gaza, and that was not something that Egyptians liked. And then the fact that during the bombardment we kept the borders closed, the fact that it became known that Mr. Mubarak was consulted about the bombardment, the helplessness that people felt about that was tangible. It was as if everyone had been disempowered. And then there was the murder of Khalid Said, the young man who was basically an everyman, and that was the point of him for the Egyptian man on the street. That this was not a young activist, this was a young man who could have been anyone, and who happened to have in his possession a video of police officers doing a deal with narcotics, a recording on a mobile phone, a video on a mobile phone. And people have been doing this, have been recording whatever they can of the misdemeanors of the regime on mobile phones and sending them to each other. So therefore, loads of people had that recording, and it could have been anyone. And he was killed by 2 policemen in the street. So it wasn't even that he was taken into custody and killed there. That was very important, that he was every man. His mother had to go and collect her son and was told that he was in a closed coffin and that he had to be buried in the middle of the night, and they could not take condolences and they could not open the coffin. She opened the coffin, and it was his sister who took photographs of him. The role of the two women here, I think, sparked a huge protest in the country and meant that a great many young people joined the Facebook page of We Are All Khalid Saeed, and therefore when that page called for a demonstration on the 25th of January, within hours it got 350,000 responses, and so all the other young groups joined in with them, and therefore the revolution kicked off on January the 25th. And I think that those are two icons, and you will see that they are not directly to do with jobs or wages or the economy, but they are to do with something hitting at some very profound and important part of the Egyptian psyche. There is, if we go back, I'm not going to do this at length, but if we go back to ancient Egypt, we find that the law is paramount. In the myth, the creation myth of Egypt, the law is paramount, and also you never expect to defeat evil completely. What you try to do is you try to balance good and evil. And the world can work and can carry on working, and you can carry on being patient as long as good and evil are in some kind of balance, and it is dynamic. But once that tips over so that there is no possibility of harmony, so that it is clear that a victory is going to evil, then something kicks in. And I think that that is really what happened in Egypt, that the darkness became too much. And therefore, when there have been many calls to strike, civil disobedience, to march, and they've attracted, 1,000 people if they were lucky. And these 1,000 would be surrounded by 5,000 security police, and they would go for them with the batons, with the electric things, whatever. This time, when the call went out, there were 2 million people on the streets, and more until eventually there were 18 million people on all the streets of Egypt. And I will finish off by saying that it was an essential part of this revolution, that it was conducted with courtesy, that it was determinedly peaceful, unless at the moment when it was having to defend itself against the police, the security forces, the thugs. And what I saw on the street and what we lived through in Tahrir Square for a period of 3 weeks was that what was being created was the civic space that we all believed that Egypt actually was. Not that it should be, that this is what we really were. And now, suddenly, that's what we were again. The people who went down into the streets to clean up after the revolution, who were wiping their own graffiti off the walls. And when people arrived and found that the square had been cleaned, they cleaned the neighboring streets, and now we have young people sort of out there every day, everybody wanting to do something. And I think that this is a great drive to strengthen the good that is in the situation. And this is why the support of the world has been so important to us. And the messages that came in from the world, and the fact that people now in Wisconsin who are, on demos for a form of social justice are carrying placards saying, this is Tahrir Square. This is why it matters, because everywhere, whatever someone does, it is instrumental in tipping the scales, either towards evil or towards good. Thank you.
Forethought was recorded at the RSA in central London. The speaker was Ahdaf Soueif and the producer was Giles Edwards. And the implications of the recent events in Egypt will be examined further in Analysis at 8:30 on Monday evening. Next this evening, after the news, could the military lead us into a green future? Tom Heap investigates for costing the Earth.
We've learned an enormous amount about how we evolved in the past and became human. But has the process that made us now stopped? Or are we still changing?